He demanded a mere vessel, a quiet, obedient woman to bear his heir and secure his sprawling dukedom. Love was a foolish, dangerous fiction he had sworn never to entertain. But Arthur Cavendish, the ruthless Duke of Wrotham, never anticipated that his purchased bride would become his most consuming addiction. London, 1882, was a city of glittering facades and rotting foundations, and no one understood this dichotomy better than Arthur Cavendish, the 9th Duke of Wrotham. Known across the drawing rooms of Mayfair as the Iron Duke, Arthur was a man sculpted from cold marble and unforgiving ambition. At 32, he possessed a fortune that rivaled the crown and a reputation that made grown men tremble. Yet a shadow loomed over his pristine empire. His title, his lands, and his legacy were in jeopardy. Should he die without a legitimate heir, the entirety of the Wrotham estate would pass to his cousin, Lord Percival, a degenerate gambler and a man Arthur despised with every fibre of his being. Marriage, therefore, was not a matter of the heart. It was a grueling, necessary business transaction. Arthur required a bride. He did not want a companion, a confidant, or a lover. He simply needed a woman of impeccable aristocratic bloodline, unblemished reputation, and desperate enough circumstances to agree to his draconian terms. Enter Lady Genevieve Stanton. The Stanton family was on the precipice of absolute ruin. Lord Thomas Stanton, the Earl of Ashbourne, had squandered his ancestral wealth at the card tables of Monte Carlo and the racing tracks of Ascot. The family's London townhouse was mortgaged to the hilt. The servants had not been paid in months, and the threat of debtor's prison was a very real, suffocating reality. Genevieve, at 21, was the family's final, tragic bargaining chip. She possessed a striking, quiet beauty, raven hair, piercing sapphire eyes, and a posture that remained regal even as her world crumbled. More importantly, she possessed the fierce, self-sacrificing devotion required to save her father from his own foolishness. The meeting between Arthur and Genevieve was orchestrated in the dimly lit, oak-panelled library of the Wrotham estate. There was no courtship, no pretense of romance. Arthur stood by the roaring fireplace, his tall, imposing frame casting a long shadow across the Persian rug. He did not offer her a seat. "I will pay your father's debts in their entirety," Arthur began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that offered no warmth. "I will restore the Ashbourne estate, and I will settle a generous allowance upon you. In exchange, you will become my wife. You will move to Wrotham Abbey in Yorkshire. You will bear me a son. Once the child is born, you may live your life as you see fit, provided you cause no scandal. We will share a name, Lady Genevieve, and a child. We will not share a life." Genevieve stood perfectly still. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of flawless porcelain. She looked at the man who was essentially buying her, his sharp jawline, his piercing grey eyes that looked at her not as a woman, but as an acquisition. "I accept your terms, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady, refusing to let him see her tremble. "You shall have your heir, and my family shall have their salvation. I expect the funds to be transferred to my father's creditors before the wedding banns are read." Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise breaking his stoic facade. He had expected tears, begging, or perhaps a display of hysterical gratitude. Instead, he received a negotiation from a woman who matched his cold pragmatism. "Agreed," he murmured. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in a cavernous, empty cathedral. It was a bleak, chilling affair. Genevieve wore a gown of heavy ivory silk that felt more like armor than a bridal dress. as Arthur slid the heavy ancestral diamond ring onto her finger. His touch was ice cold. There was no celebratory breakfast, no joyous departure. Within hours, they were in a private railway carriage, bound for the isolated moors of Yorkshire. The silence between them during the journey was suffocating. Arthur read his ledgers, ignoring her entirely, while Genevieve stared out the rain-streaked window, watching her freedom disappear into the grey landscape. Wrotham Abbey, a massive, brooding Gothic fortress of dark stone and sprawling grounds, matched its master perfectly. That night, the reality of her bargain came to claim her. Genevieve sat at the edge of the massive four-poster bed in the Duchess's chambers, clutching her silken robe. When the adjoining door opened and Arthur stepped into the room, the air grew instantly heavy. He approached her with the mechanical detachment of a man performing a duty. There were no whispered sweet nothings, no gentle caresses to ease her fear. Yet when his hands finally touched her skin, something shifted. A sudden electric jolt sparked between them, raw and entirely unscripted. Arthur froze for a fraction of a second, his grey eyes locking onto her sapphire ones. For a fleeting moment, the Iron Duke looked disoriented. Genevieve, despite her terror, refused to look away. Her chin tilted upward in defiance. The consummation of their marriage was intended to be a clinical extraction of an heir. But in the dark, silent confines of the Abbey, it morphed into a clash of wills, marked by an intensity that left them both breathless and deeply unsettled. When Arthur finally left her room before dawn, he slammed the heavy oak door behind him, fleeing not from his bride, but from the terrifying realization that he had felt something. The rules were clear. Genevieve was to be a ghost in his house, a decorative vessel waiting to fulfill her biological duty. Arthur fully expected her to spend her days embroidering, weeping, or languishing in the drawing room, like the fragile aristocratic women he despised. He retreated to his study, burying himself in estate management and parliamentary correspondence, determined to ignore the strange, burning memory of their wedding night. But Genevieve was not a ghost, and she refused to be a prisoner. Within a week of arriving at Wrotham Abbey, the servants realized they had a true mistress. Genevieve did not weep. Instead, she demanded the keys to the household. She descended into the kitchens, walked the tenant farms, and began auditing the sprawling, neglected domestic accounts. She possessed a sharp, mathematical mind, honed by years of trying to manage her father's disastrous finances. Where Arthur was the distant, fearsome overlord, Genevieve became the beating heart of the estate. Arthur first noticed the change when his meals drastically improved, and the sullen, terrified staff began to move with cheerful efficiency. Then came the afternoon he returned early from a ride to find his wife in the estate office, a place strictly forbidden to women. He stood in the doorway, his riding crop slapping rhythmically against his thigh. Genevieve was seated at his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by towering stacks of ledgers, her fingers stained with ink. She had rolled up the sleeves of her day dress, and a stray lock of raven hair fell across her eyes. She looked fiercely intelligent, wildly out of place, and breathtakingly beautiful. "May I ask, madame, what you are doing in my private office?" Arthur's voice cracked like a whip across the silent room. Genevieve did not flinch. She placed her pen down and looked up, meeting his furious gaze with cool composure. "I am saving you money, Your Grace. Your estate manager, Mr. Higgins, has been systematically embezzling from your agricultural accounts for the past 3 years. I have compiled the discrepancies here." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. Arthur stalked forward, snatching the paper. His eyes scanned the immaculate columns of numbers in her handwriting. She was right. The mathematics were undeniable. He looked from the paper to his wife, a complex storm of irritation, respect, and a dangerous, unbidden fascination brewing in his chest. "You read ledgers," he stated, as if accusing her of witchcraft. "I read many things, Arthur," she replied softly, using his given name for the first time. "I agreed to bear your child. I did not agree to sit in a parlour and rot. If I am to be the Duchess of Wrotham, I will act as one." He should have reprimanded her. He should have banished her back to her wing of the house. Instead, he found himself leaning over the desk, his face inches from hers, inhaling the scent of vanilla and old parchment that clung to her. "You are overstepping the boundaries of our contract, Genevieve." "Then rewrite the contract," she whispered back, her eyes flashing with a defiant fire that made his pulse hammer wildly in his throat. From that day forward, the invisible wall Arthur had built between them began to crack. He found himself deliberately seeking her out. He would linger in the library when she was reading, watching the way the firelight danced across her porcelain skin. He found excuses to ride out to the tenant farms on the days he knew she would be visiting the local schoolhouse. The cold, clinical nights in her bedchamber slowly transformed. The mechanical duty was replaced by a desperate, hungry passion. Arthur began to crave the softness of her skin, the sharp wit of her tongue, and the quiet strength in her eyes. He was becoming addicted to his own wife, a terrifying realization for a man who believed emotion was a fatal weakness. The fragile, unspoken tension between them shattered spectacularly a month later when Arthur's dreaded cousin, Lord Percival, arrived at Wrotham Abbey uninvited. Percival was a slippery, venomous man who deeply resented Genevieve's presence, knowing a child from her would ruin his inheritance. During a tense, candlelit dinner, Percival drank heavily, his sneer growing more pronounced. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his jaw clenched, watching his cousin with the eyes of a predator. "I must say, cousin," Percival slurred, leaning heavily across the table toward Genevieve. "I'm surprised you chose a Stanton. Everyone in London knows old Lord Ashbourne practically sold you to settle his debts. Tell me, Genevieve, how does it feel to be bought like a prized broodmare?" The dining room plunged into a suffocating, deadly silence. Genevieve paled, her hands gripping her linen napkin under the table, the humiliation burning her throat. Before she could utter a single word in her defense, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the room. Arthur had crushed his crystal wine goblet in his bare hand. Blood dripped from his knuckles onto the immaculate white tablecloth, but Arthur didn't seem to notice. He rose slowly from his chair, a towering monument of pure, lethal rage. The carefully constructed mask of the detached, emotionless Iron Duke was gone, replaced by a possessive fury so violent it made the air in the room vibrate. "You will stand up, Percival," Arthur commanded, his voice a terrifying, deadly whisper. "You will apologize to my wife, and then you will leave my house. And if you ever speak her name again, I will personally ensure you never draw another breath." Percival, suddenly sobered by the murderous look in Arthur's eyes, scrambled backward, his chair tipping over. He stammered a pathetic apology and fled the room. Arthur remained standing, his chest heaving, his bleeding hand ignored. Genevieve stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He hadn't defended his property. He had defended her. Arthur turned to look at her, the blood dripping steadily from his hand. In his eyes, Genevieve saw the terrifying truth he was still trying to fight. The ruthless Duke, who only wanted an heir, had fallen devastatingly, irrevocably in love with his wife. But the journey to their true surrender was far from over, for pride is a thick armor, and the ghosts of Arthur's past were about to collect their dues. The heavy oak doors of the dining room remained firmly shut long after Lord Percival's frantic footsteps faded into the sprawling corridors of Wrotham Abbey. Inside, the oppressive silence was broken only by the steady dripping of blood from Arthur's hand onto the polished floorboards. Genevieve stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The man before her, the ruthless, calculating duke who viewed her merely as a transaction, was trembling, not from pain, but from the sheer force of his own untamed fury. Without a word, Genevieve moved. She did not ring for the servants. Instead, she retrieved a clean linen napkin from the table, poured a measure of brandy into a fresh glass, and approached her husband. Arthur watched her with wary, storm-colored eyes, like a wild beast unaccustomed to a gentle hand. "Give it to me," she murmured softly, her voice steady despite the chaotic hammering of her heart. Arthur hesitated, his jaw tight, before slowly unclenching his ruined hand. Shards of crystal were embedded deeply in his palm. Genevieve guided him to a velvet armchair near the roaring hearth. She knelt before him, a duchess on the floor, and began the painstaking work of removing the glass. When she poured the brandy over his open wounds to cleanse them, Arthur did not flinch, though his breath hitched when her soft, cool fingers wrapped the linen tightly around his knuckles. "You did not have to do that," Genevieve whispered, her gaze fixed on the makeshift bandage. "Percival is a fool. His words mean nothing to me." "They mean everything in this house," Arthur replied, his voice a low, rough rumble. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his fingers tentatively tracing the delicate curve of her jawline. The touch sent a violent shiver down her spine. "You are my wife, Genevieve. No one disrespects you under my roof. No one." For a breathtaking moment, the air between them grew impossibly thick. Genevieve looked up, meeting his intense gaze, and saw the heavy, unsaid confessions lingering in his eyes. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was shockingly tender, a stark contrast to the desperate, hungry encounters in the dark of night. It was a kiss of apology, of profound reverence, and of a terrifying vulnerability. But as quickly as the walls had fallen, they violently slammed back into place. Arthur abruptly pulled away, his expression hardening into the familiar, impenetrable mask of the Iron Duke. He stood, turning his back to her, terrified by the depth of the emotion that had just consumed him. To love was to invite ruin. He had watched his own mother waste away from the heartbreak of his father's cruel infidelities, and he had sworn to never surrender his soul to another human being. "I will be departing for London on the morning train," Arthur stated coldly, staring into the fire. "Parliamentary matters require my immediate attention. I expect to be gone for several weeks. You will manage the estate in my absence." Genevieve felt as though she had been struck. The sudden shift from tender protector to distant stranger was a cruel whiplash. She stood, her spine stiffening with pride. "As you wish, Your Grace. Have a safe journey." For 6 agonizing weeks, Arthur remained in London, burying himself in politics, investments, and the bustling, smoke-filled gentlemen's clubs of Mayfair. He attempted to purge Genevieve from his mind, but it was an exercise in futility. She haunted his every waking thought. He saw her raven hair in the crowded ballrooms. He smelled her vanilla scent in empty carriages. He was a man starving, addicted to the very woman he had banished from his sight. Back in Yorkshire, Genevieve threw herself into her duties, masking her profound loneliness with relentless industry. However, a strange exhaustion began to plague her. Her morning rides were replaced by bouts of severe nausea. When the venerable estate physician, Dr. Harrison, was finally summoned, he delivered the news with a warm, grandfatherly smile. The Duke of Wrotham was going to have his heir. Genevieve sat alone in her chamber, a hand resting on her flat stomach. She should have felt victorious. She had secured her family's future and fulfilled her end of the bargain. But as she drafted a formal, brief letter to her husband in London, tears stained the heavy parchment. The contract dictated that once the child was born, she was free to live a separate life. The very child growing inside her, the symbol of their union, was the instrument of their impending separation. When Arthur received the letter in his London townhouse, the world seemed to stop spinning. He stared at her elegant handwriting, a chaotic storm of elation, terror, and possessive panic tearing through him. He had his heir. His legacy was safe. Yet the thought brought him absolutely no comfort. He immediately ordered his carriage, leaving his affairs in disarray, and travelled through the night, arriving at Wrotham Abbey just as the dawn broke over the frost-covered moors. He strode into the breakfast room, still wearing his travel-stained greatcoat, and found Genevieve sipping tea, looking pale but undeniably radiant. He stopped in the doorway, his chest heaving. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Genevieve set her teacup down gently. "Dr. Harrison is quite certain. You will have your heir by the end of autumn, Arthur." Instead of closing the distance and taking her in his arms, Arthur remained frozen. His mind raced back to the ironclad terms he had dictated in her father's library. "Once the child is born, you may live your life as you see fit." The realization that she now had the power to leave him paralyzed his heart. Acting entirely out of defensive fear, Arthur delivered the cruelest blow he could muster. "Excellent," he said, his voice dripping with forced, icy detachment. "You have performed your duty perfectly, madam. Once the child is delivered, I shall arrange a generous settlement for your separate establishment, should you wish to depart for the continent." Genevieve's sapphire eyes widened in shock, then darkened with an exquisite, heart-breaking pain. She stood up slowly, her chin raised in absolute, unyielding pride. "You need not trouble yourself, Your Grace. I will make my own arrangements." She swept past him without another word, leaving Arthur standing in the ruins of his own making, suffocating under the weight of his colossal stupidity. The following months were a masterclass in silent agony. The sprawling halls of Wrotham Abbey felt like a frozen tomb. Genevieve retreated entirely to the east wing, communicating with Arthur only through formal notes delivered by the staff. She blossomed beautifully with the pregnancy, but her smile was entirely absent. Arthur watched her from afar, a tortured ghost in his own home. He pored over estate maps in his study, drinking heavily in the evenings, haunted by the realization that his pride had driven away the only light he had ever known. His trusted butler, Mr. Carson, an elderly man who had known Arthur since childhood, finally broke the unspoken rules of servitude. Pouring Arthur's third whiskey of the night, Carson spoke without looking up. "A man who builds walls to keep out his enemies, Your Grace, often finds he has walled himself in. Her Grace is leaving for the dower house on the northern moors tomorrow morning. She feels the abbey is too draughty for her current delicate state." Arthur's head snapped up. The dower house was 5 miles away, isolated and bleak. "She did not request my permission to move." "I believe, sir, she no longer feels she requires it," Carson replied softly, exiting the room. The next morning, a heavy, unseasonal fog rolled over the Yorkshire moors. Genevieve's carriage departed early, loaded with her personal trunks. Arthur stood at the window of his study, watching the carriage disappear into the grey mist, his heart screaming at him to stop her. but his paralyzing fear of rejection rooted his boots to the floor. He was pulled from his misery by the sudden, frantic arrival of one of the tenant farmers, riding a lathered horse into the courtyard. Arthur hurried down the steps. "Your Grace," the farmer shouted, breathless. "It's Lord Percival. He's been seen on the old toll road with 3 rough-looking men. They've blocked the pass. Her Grace's carriage is heading right into them." Percival, the degenerate cousin, stripped of his inheritance and drowning in debt, had realized that the child in Genevieve's womb was the final nail in his coffin. A carriage accident on the treacherous, foggy moors would solve all his problems. A monstrous, blinding terror seized Arthur, a primal, violent fear that shattered every wall of ice he had ever built. He did not call for the guards. He did not wait to saddle his best stallion properly. He grabbed his heavy riding crop, swung onto his horse bareback, and tore out of the courtyard, riding like a demon unleashed from hell. The old toll road was treacherous, winding along steep, rocky drops. As Arthur crested the hill, the fog parted just enough to reveal a scene that stopped his heart. Genevieve's carriage was halted, the coachman thrown to the mud. 3 men were holding the horses, while Percival was trying to force the carriage door open, shouting drunken, desperate threats. Arthur's roar echoed across the valley, a sound of pure, unadulterated savagery. He drove his horse directly into the nearest thug, sending the man flying into the ditch. Arthur vaulted from his mount before it even stopped moving, his heavy crop coming down across the second man's collarbone with a sickening crack. The third man took one look at the Duke's murderous eyes and fled into the fog. Percival turned, his face draining of color as Arthur advanced on him. Arthur dropped the crop. He grabbed his cousin by the throat with both hands, lifting him off his feet, driving him back against the wooden frame of the carriage. "I warned you," Arthur hissed, his voice trembling with a lethal promise. "I told you what would happen if you ever came near my wife again." "Arthur, please," Percival choked, his eyes bulging. Arthur's grip tightened, the violent urge to snap his cousin's neck almost overwhelming. But a soft, trembling hand touched his shoulder. "Arthur, stop. He is not worth your soul. Please." Genevieve had stepped out of the carriage. She was pale, clutching her swollen stomach, but her eyes were fiercely fixed on him. At the sound of her voice, the red mist cleared from Arthur's vision. He threw Percival to the ground like discarded rubbish. "If you are ever seen in England again, I will hunt you down like a rabid dog. Run." Percival scrambled to his feet and vanished into the mist. Arthur turned to his wife. His chest heaved, his hands were shaking, and for the first time in his adult life, a tear slipped down his cheek. He fell to his knees in the muddy road, right in front of her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing his face against her stomach. "I am a fool," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I am a blind, terrified fool. I built an empire of ice, Genevieve, and I was so deeply afraid of the fire you brought into my life. I pushed you away because I was terrified of how entirely I belonged to you." Genevieve looked down at the mighty, feared Iron Duke, kneeling in the mud, surrendering his entire heart. She slowly sank to her knees beside him, cupping his face in her hands. "You are an idiot, Arthur Cavendish," she whispered, her own tears falling freely. "But you are my idiot." Later that evening, back in the warmth of the master suite at Wrotham Abbey, Arthur walked over to the fireplace. In his hand was the original marriage contract, the document of their cold business transaction. He looked at Genevieve, who was resting against the pillows, wrapped in his heavy velvet dressing gown. Without breaking eye contact, Arthur tossed the parchment into the flames, watching it turn to ash. "No more contracts," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking her hand. No more conditions. Only you. Forever. 2 months later, as the first snows of winter blanketed the Yorkshire moors, the cries of a newborn echoed through the halls of Wrotham Abbey. It was a boy, robust and healthy. But as Arthur held his son for the first time, he did not look at the child as an heir, a title, or a secured legacy. He looked at the infant as a piece of his soul, created from an undeniable, all-consuming love. He handed the boy back to Genevieve, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead, knowing that the ruthless Duke had finally been completely, beautifully conquered by his Duchess. The cold walls of Wrotham Abbey could not withstand the burning fire of true devotion, proving that even the most guarded hearts can be transformed by unexpected love. If you were captivated by Arthur and Genevieve's passionate journey from a ruthless contract to an unbreakable soul-stirring bond, please hit the like button. Share this dramatic historical romance with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories of love, betrayal, and ultimate surrender.